Welcome to Voices from the Abyss. If you're listening tonight, you're not alone. Beneath every stretch of open water, there are depths we've never seen and things we've never discovered. Tonight's story begins in complete darkness, miles below the surface, where something ancient is still moving. So settle in, get comfortable, and listen closely, because far below you, something is awake. Out on open water, there are things that do not hunt. They do not chase. They do not hunger. They rise. And when they do, there is no fight, no escape, no meaning to it at all. This account comes from a pirate vessel that crossed something in the Atlantic that did not see them as prey, only as something passing through its domain. The Crimson Tide was 3 days out of Tortuga when the ocean went flat. Not calm, flat, as if the water itself was holding its breath. Captain Aldrich Voss noticed it first. 22 years at sea had fine-tuned his senses to know when something was wrong. He read the water the way other men read scripture, with reverence and the particular attention of someone who knew that misreading it meant putting his men in danger, or worse. He was at the bow rail when the first tentacle broke the surface. It came up off the port side, 50 meters out, rising from the water with a slowness that was hard to digest. It was simply too large. His eyes kept trying to recognize it. A mast from a sunken ship? A whale's fluke? Anything with a precedent. But the recognition kept failing because the thing kept rising. It was as wide as 3 men laying end to end, and it tapered to a point 30 meters above the waterline. The underside was lined with suckers, each the size of a cannon wheel, pale and rimmed with something dark and serrated. It hung in the air for a moment, salt water sheeting off it in curtains. Then it came down on the Crimson Tide's forecastle like judgment. The sound was the worst thing Voss had ever heard. Not the impact. The impact was enormous, but quick. A single catastrophic percussion that he felt in his back teeth, and those had rotted out long ago. It was the sounds that followed, the forecastle railing shearing away, the deck planking splitting lengthwise, and beneath all of it, immediate and terrible, the screaming. He was running before he realized, and what he found at the forecastle stopped him in his tracks. Martin, his navigator, had been caught mid-step. The tentacle had come down across his torso and the deck at the same time, and the result was something that came straight from Voss's nightmares. The man had been compressed into the planking from the chest down, his upper half twisted at an angle that, if still intact, his spine would not have allowed. One arm extended towards the rail as if reaching for salvation. He'd almost made it. Young Cass, barely 16, had made it 2 steps towards the companionway. A single sucker at the tentacle's trailing edge had caught him across the back as the limb withdrew. The serrated ring found no resistance in Cass. Voss found him against the rail and did not look at his lower half. He kept moving. Old Ferris, who had survived more than 1 shipwreck in his lifetime, 2 naval engagements, and had always said drowning wasn't in his future, was gone. No trace, not even his boots. "All hands," Voss's voice came out steady, despite being shaken to his very core. "Arms and powder, move!" They moved. His crew were pirates, which meant they were many things that polite society would disapprove of, but they were not cowards. Within 30 seconds, the deck was full of men with muskets and cutlasses. 2 of his men were dragging a swivel gun towards the port rail. The surface was still flat. Whatever was below was holding. "What in God's..." started Pelham, his first mate, appearing at his shoulder. The stern exploded. 2 tentacles this time, rising on either side of the rudder post, crossing over the deck like the fingers of a closing hand. The Crimson Tide shrieked. The sound of her hull timbers flexing under a load they were never built to bear was a deep wooden groan that Voss felt as much as he heard. The tentacles found the men between them and tightened. Cobb went first. He was a broad man, heavy-set, and Voss didn't see what happened to him, but heard his descent from this world. A rapid, dense sequence of sounds like green wood splitting, his ribcage failing all at once under the pressure of a sucker that had found his midsection. He managed to make 1 sound, and then the tentacle lifted what remained of him and took it over the rail. Voss watched Cobb's legs disappear last, still kicking with some residual signal from his nervous system that hadn't yet received the news. Reyes fought. He had always been a fighter. It was the thing about Reyes that Voss had always half admired and half pitied. The absolute refusal to accept any situation as final. He had a belaying pin, and he swung it against the tentacle that had his left arm, but it did nothing. The tentacle pulled, and Voss heard the shoulders separate before Reyes started screaming. A wet tearing sound followed immediately by the higher register of genuine agony. He was still screaming when the tentacle took him over the side. The screaming stopped when he hit the water. The list to port was worsening. "Fire!" The swivel gun went off. The shot struck the nearest tentacle, and the limb recoiled with a force that sent spray across the entire deck. A flinch that spoke of something capable of pain, and Voss felt a desperate lurching hope that was ripped out of him when he saw the tentacle return. It came back faster. It found the swivel gun and the man behind it, Torres, who had a daughter in Havana. He had shown Voss a portrait of her once, laughing in Tortuga. The wrathful appendage wrapped around Torres from the hips down and pulled. What came back over the rail and what went into the water were not the same quantity of man. Voss turned away and kept moving. Looking would not help Torres. He was already gone. The tentacles were everywhere now. Pelham had a boarding axe that he was using with both hands. He was hacking at the limb that had his leg below the knee, and the blade was biting. Dark fluid welled up around each strike, and for a single moment, it looked like it might work. The tentacle released. Pelham staggered back, his leg intact, but not without damage. Angled below the knee was where the sucker had found the bone. He took one step, and the results told him everything about what the sucker had done to his tibia. Pelham went down. He was struggling to rise when the next tentacle took him from above, wrapping his chest and one arm. This one did not squeeze. It lifted him, almost gently, and swung him once against the mast with a force that ended all of Pelham's problems at once. Then it took him into the water. Big Dantry lasted longest. He was the largest man on the crew and the strongest. He had a boarding axe of his own, and the fury of a man who had decided he was going to make whatever was killing him regret the decision. He severed the tip of one tentacle entirely, a meter of it dropping onto the deck and continuing to move, the suckers flexing against the planking with horrible autonomy. Dantry was moving towards the rail, axe raised, roaring something in Dutch that Voss didn't speak, but somehow understood, when the tentacle came from directly above. It took Dantry by the head and shoulders. The pressure it applied was brief and total. Voss looked away before it finished, but he heard it clearly. The sound of Dantry's departure was something he would carry for whatever time he had remaining. Sarah, his carpenter, made it to the longboat. She was the fastest person on the crew and the most practical. She had the davit lines half loose when the tentacle found her. It took her by the waist, and she grabbed the davit rope, holding on with everything she had. For a moment, she was suspended between the creature and the ship. With her hands white on the rope, Voss was moving toward her. He already knew he wouldn't make it in time. The rope held for 4 seconds. Sarah held for 5. When her grip failed, she just looked at Voss across the deck with an expression of defeat as she was pulled into the depths, longboat and all. The crimson tide rolled. The ocean came up cold and consuming as Voss went under in a chaos of bubbles and debris. Planking, rope, a boot he recognized as Pelham's, a portrait of a young girl spinning slowly downward in the undertow. He kicked away from the wreckage, shed his coat, shed his sword belt, and surfaced into silence. The ship was gone, yet a crimson tide remained. He was alone. There was no wreckage large enough to hold him. He searched his surroundings and could see no other heads above the water. The debris field was spreading and thinning around him in the flat, glassy ocean. He could see, 20 meters away, the severed tip of tentacles still floating, its suckers making their slow, reflexive contractions against nothing. Voss was a strong swimmer. He held on to that fact like it was his last hope for survival. Then the water around his legs went warm. He looked down and saw darkness ascending. The thermal displacement of its body pushed him upward as it came. It lifted him in the water, and the surface around him began to change as the mantle broke it. He was in awe at what he saw. The body rose in front of him, vast and mottled purple-black, each diamond ridge of its skin wide enough to walk on. It pulsed with a deep red bioluminescence visible through the skin, like firelight through oiled paper. The tentacles caressed the surface around him, 8 of them, radiating outward, still now, not reaching. He was staring directly at the damned devil that had taken everything from him, and it remained perfectly, horribly still. Then the eye opened. 3 meters from his face, amber, banded in copper and gold. The pupil, a dark horizontal bar that contracted slowly as it met the surface light. The eye was larger than the Crimson Tide's mainsail. It was the most extraordinary thing he had ever seen, which seemed an injustice so profound he almost laughed. It looked at him. He stopped treading water. His legs ceased their motion gradually as the cold consumed him. He began to sink, and the devil sunk with him, smooth and unhurried, following him below the surface. It held him in its focus as the water closed over its head and the light faded until the cold became the only remaining sensation he could experience. The eye remained amber and enormous, locked onto him as if to drink in every last drop of anguish it had caused him. The last thing Aldous Voss saw in the fading dark of the Atlantic Ocean was the pupil of that eye contracting one final time. Not in hunger, not in malice, in the patient, absolute, and indifferent recognition of something that had watched 1,000 men sink in 1,000 pairs of eyes, and found in each one the same small and startled understanding that the ocean had never been theirs to sail, that it had only ever been borrowed. Thank you for listening to Voices from the Abyss. If you enjoyed tonight's story, make sure to follow so you don't miss what rises next. And if you find yourself near the water, listening, just remember, not everything beneath the surface is asleep. Good night.